So welcome to the afternoon keynote, everybody. My name is Wendt. I am a member of the advisory board here at Carroll's Lab and also the director of content here for this conference. And this afternoon in our final keynote, we're going to be talking about robocalling mitigation, implementing the stir-shaken framework. I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody in this room about the issue of robocalling, mostly related to caller ID spoofing that's been kind of a scourge for the last several years. According to the FCC, there's as many as 4 billion calls a month, 4 billion robocalls a month. It's the number one complaint that they receive, representing roughly 60% of all complaints. Obviously, the efforts to mitigate this problem have been going for a number of years now, including predecessor IETF RFCs to stir-shaken, legislative efforts, including the Truth in Caller ID Act, efforts by the FCC, industry efforts, etc. But we are finally getting close to implementing what appears to be a solution. We'll hear more from our panelists about that. Thanks much to both efforts in the IETF as well as industry associations like ADIS and SIP Forum, and of course the FCC's, I guess I should say encouragement at this point in time, although there is an NPRM out that may be more than encouragement if encouragement isn't successful. So we've got two panelists this afternoon. Chris Wendt with Comcast has been in this area for a long time. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit more fully. And Scott McGaldy with T-Mobile. And Chris is going to start off with some slides, kind of giving a little bit of background on this. Scott's going to make some comments. Then the panelists and I are going to have a short conversation, and then we will open it up to Q&A to the audience. So without further ado, I'll bring Chris up here.
Thanks, Warren. I thought I'd talk today, and I've given talks in the past at this conference about some of the more technical aspects of the protocols and the PKI and crypto stuff. But now that the industry has sort of gotten the ball rolling and deployments are out there, I thought that would be good to focus on a little bit. I'll start off with a few slides to sort of, give an overview, what is stir-shaken, what, and maybe more focus on, what the intent is. There's misconceptions out there about, what we're doing versus other things that are going on in the industry, since it really is like, a multi-layer effort to try to combat robocalls. So what I'm going to describe is sort of the base layer that we're putting in place. So stir-shaken at its heart really addresses the identity of the caller. As probably most of you know in this room, it's very easy to spoof calls these days. The tools we have, allow us to do it, extremely inexpensively, and the robocallers, the illegitimate robocallers, have really taken advantage of that. And as you probably also know, in the telephone network, there is no mechanism today to prove that the person using that telephone number has legitimate ownership of that telephone number. So that's really at the heart of what we're trying to solve in the telephone network, and sort of starting from ground zero and getting to the point where all calls have these indicators, is a huge effort, lots of people involved, and we're sort of, I don't know if we can say we're halfway through it. We've come pretty far so far, and there's a lot of folks that have started to implement it, but there's more things to do. The other aspect of it is, while there is a lot of technology involved and, the deployment of it is mostly a technical thing, there's a lot of both policy and enforcement reasons why we want to want to do these things, obviously. And so when those things get involved, there's lawyers and legal enforcement and other things that obvious legislation, all those things, come together in one big thing. So that it has been sort of an interesting path to get here. But we wanted to make sure that the framework covered those things and that the policies were very clear and that the tools to do enforcement were also explicitly part of what we're deploying. So from a policy point of view, the most important thing is obviously the connection of the telephone number to a proper owner. And, in North America, in the North American numbering plan, there's, it's a regulated system. Folks that own telephone numbers, or I shouldn't say own telephone numbers, the folks that use telephone numbers are given that explicit right under regulatory rules. So this actually helps us in some sense because enforcement of those policies becomes sort of a direct relationship there, as opposed to other things that are sort of on the internet, like domain names and other things where it's a little freer. The telephone number, North American numbering plan is, there is some ability to tie those telephone numbers back to some authoritative person that has some regulatory responsibilities for those telephone numbers. From an enforcement point of view, because we can tie those telephone numbers to responsible parties, if once we introduce this trusted relationship into the network, if someone has identified themselves as the owner of that telephone number and is doing bad things with that telephone number, it's very easy to trace that back to that responsible party and enforce when they're doing bad things. So that's sort of the other major part of that when a telephone call is signed and goes to the other side, somebody says, hey, this guy is trying to fraud me. Once we have a major percentage of telephone calls that are signed in the network, we have a direct traceback mechanism that leads back to the origination of that call. So, there's two names associated with this, stir and shaken. It really represents, the two major parts of it. Stir is the core sets of protocols and the definition of how PKI is used in the system. Shaken is really about taking those tools and putting them into this framework. And over the past, I'd say, how long has it been active? Yeah, well, maybe, I guess it's been about a year or so. The governance has really taken shape. The industry has come together. We've selected the management and the board of directors of those that will govern the system for North American Numbering Plan in the U.S. We've also selected a policy administrator, and the policy administrator is right in the middle of the diagram there. And essentially, that's sort of the borderline between the authority and the technical parts of the trust system that is deployed as part of the PKI, the certificates that are used within the system. So anyone that has some relationship to telephone numbers will be authorized to have certificates that they can use to sign calls and then also become the responsible party when traceback or enforcement is necessary. So it's sort of a closed loop there. The policy administrator has been selected. It's iConnective, and we're currently under the process of approving the certificate policy, and the hope is by the November, December timeframe, they'll be ready to start issuing tokens that will allow providers to get certificates. In terms of what StirShaken is, sort of addressing the misconceptions, as I sort of talked about, StirShaken is really about the trust and verification of the identities. It definitely has nothing to do with determining whether that call is illegitimate or legitimate, and like basically, the intent of the call or the content of the call. It has nothing to do with media or anything like that. It's just signing the identity at origination and then having the ability to absolutely validate that identity when the call is terminated at the end provider or device. But the intent here is that when you can validate the identity, you can use that as a major tool in terms of identifying spam patterns and other things. So basically, as I mentioned, this is a multi-layer system. We're putting the trust layer at the base layer, and then applications can sit on top that do call analytics or other techniques that we might find that work in the system. But both of those things will work together. The hope is that, once you have trust in the system and you have a quick way of enforcing when people are doing bad things, the needs for those tools aren't as great, but I'm sure, we'll continue to have some level of tools, some level of call features that allow people to set their preferences on what types of calls they want to get, who they want to talk to, other things like that, would then, have some basis of trust that, when, family, friends, colleagues are calling, you know that it's them, you can pick up the telephone. So in terms of what we've accomplished to date in 2019, as you might know, the FCC sort of set a goal to have all the major service providers implementing StirShaken in their networks by the end of this year. That pretty much has been done. There's more participants that need to join the party, but at least we have a good start. And in terms of representing a fairly major portion of the telephone calls that are on the network, or the trusted telephone calls that are on the network, we're well on our way. Like I said, the governance and policy administration are already in place. And we're already interoperating. There's been a bunch of press releases been put out. And just recently I noticed with iOS 13, it's a small win, but there's actually a little check mark in the call logs to show that, the call was verified. And you can actually see that. I think it's the majority is on the East Coast in terms of deployment right now, but I have witnessed calls from Xfinity Mobile to Comcast landline, to Verizon, to T-Mobile that have all showed this check mark. So it's sort of like a small win, but definitely great to see that happening live production networks and on major device. I think we'll also talk about some of the things we're doing specific to our networks as well, but that was great to see. There's a couple pending things that we're working on. So right now we have the framework for trust of direct telephone number access. If you know anything about how enterprises work, call centers, legitimate robocalling, often those numbers are legitimately spoofed. And there's typically an indirect ownership of that number to who is actually originating that call. So, you know, if there's like multiple, if your voice origination is multi-homed, or you're doing least cost routing or other things like that, you typically have multiple originating service providers that are putting your calls onto the network. They don't have direct knowledge of your ownership of that telephone, so that's a problem that we have a number of proposals. There's proposals around enterprise registries that can enterprises can and VoIP providers can register their numbers with a centralized registry. One that I am a proponent of, and a number of us are a proponent of, and we've been discussing in IETF, is certificate delegation. So the mechanism of easily delegating the authority of that number to a VoIP provider or a enterprise, and they can directly sign those calls and manage, you know, sort of their own destiny there. I think and it has a very clear trust model associated with it. And if those entities are doing bad things, you know, that authority can be revoked easily as well. So, sure, go ahead.
A service provider is delegating some numbers to a customer, and then the customer is starting a call or sending an SMS using those numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So the certificate that is signed, that is signing this STIR object, does it have to be validated by the service provider as well, or can the customer have a certificate from a well-known CA and continue with signing it using that certificate?
So the idea is that you have a chain of certificates that go back to an authoritative party. So that would be like the TN provider.
Right.
So for example, like bandwidth, you buy a bunch of numbers from bandwidth and stick them in your PBX. They would delegate a certificate scoped just to those telephone numbers. You would sign the call, and there's been a little bit of a debate whether the originating provider actually has to check that or not. I would advocate that it shouldn't need to, because that trust has been delegated to you. And if you're a bad actor, you can, like I said, you can easily have that trust revoked.
But for that delegated certificate, the subsidiary has to have signing material for the key.
Correct.
So that key has to be shared then between.
Yeah, so in the specs, we utilize Acme protocol. So basically, the enterprise can generate their own private key and then get a cert based on that with a certificate signing request. And then the chain goes up through delegation to the service provider cert, and then, you know, up to the root cert.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so, you know, it's very active discussion with opinions on many sides, but it is also something we need to make sure we close the loop on sooner rather than later. Another thing is, you know, the issue of SS7 versus VoIP. STIR-SHAKEN is pretty much just a SIP protocol. It does not support SS7, so some mechanism of incentivizing IP to IP interconnection, you know, obviously will help here. Hopefully the industry is sort of moving in that direction anyways, so, but that is still an issue. Another thing that's been widely discussed with many opinions on many sides is, a standard display framework. So, should the user have some consistent view when, either the call is trusted or there's, it's been identified as a potential spam call or things like that, so that consumers can be educated about that. We made some proposals about, mobile phone is obviously an easier device to handle because you have a nice graphical user display. For landline phones with analog caller ID displays, that can become a harder thing. We've proposed standardizing vBracket as a prefix to the calling name. But, there's other techniques that folks have been utilizing there. And the other thing, this is just a more forward-looking thing, is part of the activities of the governance authority is to continuously monitor what's going on. So if the bad actors do find any potential ways around the system or other things, that we quickly adapt to those things and move forward. So it really has been sort of a joint partnership. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Governance Authority Technical Committee that, our role is basically to make sure that, there's a rapid communications channel between the folks monitoring what's going on and the standards community that are responsible for the specs that are implemented. So we hope to, continue to do that, continue to make sure that these tools work as expected, and get to a point where we at least curb these things to reasonable levels, if not eliminate them to some extent. So that's my introduction, I guess, in transition to.
Most everybody's on this side of the room anyways. So, hi, I'm Scott McGaldy, and it's a pleasure to be here. Third year in a row I've been at the RTC speaking, so starting to feel like I come home to do this. My apologies, first of all. I am a fill-in for logistic reasons. The person we were going to have from T-Mobile here couldn't make it, and there's actually an update going on right now to the FCC today on Stir Shaken from T-Mobile. So I'm filling in. This is not my primary role. I'm actually head of standardization for T-Mobile, but some of the Stir Shaken stuff does fall into my group's purview, and I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we've learned with this and some of the things that we're doing. The reason this is important is because robocalls are annoying to people, and our company is very focused in on having a very good user experience. And being annoyed with calls that you don't want is distractive. It eats up your battery. You don't want people to sell you things or ask you to vote for certain people. And it's a problem that we see that's growing within the United States. And globally, it's not too much of a problem. It is kind of uniquely an American problem. So it is not surprising that the solutions for this are coming primarily here in the USA. There's been a lot of work going on, as Warren mentioned. There's been legislative work, regulatory work, and some technology work that's been going on with this. Prior to Stir Shaken, T-Mobile started doing some scam identification and blocking to help users select to not have their calls. But with this technology, we really have a much better focus on the ability to characterize traffic and then to have a trust component to it. Prior to Stir Shaken, just the call ID and blocking, we had blocked over 1 billion robocalls, junk calls that were coming in. So that's an enormous amount of traffic. So you can imagine the amount of traffic this is adding into everybody's network. And I think Chris mentioned it was about a year ago, stir shaken. Yeah, it was about a year ago. The FCC has asked that the operators get this moving in 2019, much to the annoyance of some operators. T-Mobile started a year ago turning this on and doing our initial tests. And as of April of this year, we have deployed on 100% of our network already. So it was quite a thing for us, and we pushed very hard with this. We did do some interop testing with Comcast, and that's been going on for quite a while. And we're even doing some additional testing with Comcast and Verizon's to do 3 or more networks being involved at the same time. How do you move across these? We've been doing testing with AT&T, and then of course there's regional operators and other operators that we still have to work with, and some additional planned one. But it just gives you an idea of the scale of the difficulty of just implementing this technology that we're still facing. This isn't going to be a fast solution. This is going to take a little bit of time. It's huge, and the guys who are these scammers will be continually looking for weak points to exploit things. So as Chris said, we have to stay on our toes to watch what this is and to adapt to it. There's already some additional protocol enhancements going on within standardization to deal with this. Just to give you an idea how effective, though, stir shaken is used, I want to share some KPIs that we pulled from our network that I can share with you, because we're sharing them with the FCC today as well. So this is one day. This is one day in a T-Mobile network, what we see. We've seen 4.6 million calls be attested to be declared trusted calls. And those are calls from T-Mobile that have gone to Comcast and AT&T. So just a small amount of the traffic there. And from Comcast to AT&T, we've seen 1 million attestations on calls. That's quite a lot. It's starting to really look good. And of all the calls between those 3 networks, we've only seen 4% of them that have been failing validation. So some good numbers. And I do want to add, too, another part of this is not just the networks. We have to have the right user equipment out there. And currently, we're selling 17 models of phone that will support the full stir, shake, and thing. So that's going to take a little bit of time to get it into everybody's equipment, and then sell that equipment to the user and get this out into the populace. So I encourage you to go out and buy a new T-Mobile phone today to help with this if you're really committed to stir shaking. So that's another part of this. So there is still a human factor, is really what that alludes to. It's the human factor of getting new equipment into people's hand, making them want to do this, and then having them use the equipment. We do have a few things that we're still doing and actively working on. We're doing some additional protocol testing. I think it is on some of the Acme protocol. I think you guys might be involved in it with us. So
Acceptance. Sorry. Acceptance testing.
Yeah, acceptance test. Okay, yeah. And we are working with the device vendors to get more of this implemented faster. There's been some additions into iOS 13 to get it fully into the Apple devices. More network nodes I've mentioned, and to get the additional operators on there. So we still have quite a ways to go, but that's some of the things we have done in implementing this technology. So thank you.
So both of you touched on, some of the topics that I wanted to maybe drill down into just a little bit more, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. But one of the things that Chris talked about a little bit was the enterprise call centers and kind of legitimate spoofing cases. And so the enterprise call center is an example of that, but there's a lot of examples of that. There are abuse shelters. There are doctors who get calls in the middle of the night and are returning patients' calls on a personal cell phone, but don't want the patient to have their personal cell phone number, and a whole host of others of that description. So I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about, how stir shaken is expected to handle those situations.
Yeah, so, I mentioned some of the proposals on the table. In some sense, like at Comcast, we deal with this problem where, uh, our techs go out and call customers and they get blocked by spam things. We want some, or we did it. Yeah. Hello? Okay. Sorry. We want to tackle, making sure that when there's a legitimate call from legitimate source and they're representing themselves correctly, that call gets sent through. One thing I actually forgot to mention was there's another spec that we're working on that I think is going to be really interesting called rich call data. And this is, for enterprises that want to go beyond just, the typical calling name. Also want to deliver potentially, logos and other, it could be any information really that can be signed and validated. And, there's still thoughts around, policies on how those things get applied. Obviously, you don't want people sending logos that, people don't, maybe inappropriate or something like that. But we believe there's a lot of great opportunity so that, whether it's a tech calling or whether it's, Home Depot is trying to deliver, a box to you or whatever else, that just gives more indication of who it is that's calling, and you can more easily make a determination whether you want to pick up the call or not.
Add anything to that? Okay, cool. So another thing that we talked about a little bit, but I'd like to maybe get a little bit more insight in that, is that, so Stir Shaken is, Scott mentioned that in the T-Mobile network anyway, this was 100% implemented. There's a fair amount of testing going on between at least some of the carriers and so on. At least in my case, I don't think I'm seeing a great decrease in robocalls, however. So there's maybe a little bit of a dichotomy there, and I think some of that probably has to do with some of the platform challenges that we talked about and you touched upon a little bit. The fact that the network operators can authenticate these calls doesn't necessarily mean that a consumer is seeing that quite yet. So what do you think needs to happen before there's some effect to the people out here in the audience in terms of platform challenges, handsets, devices, et cetera?
I think there has been effect already on the consumers, but the problem is it's been so tiny so far that it's difficult to perceive. I gave you those numbers. Just between three networks, we've delivered 4.6 million attestations. They've delivered 1 million back to us. That's 5.6 million phone calls just in one day. That's not nearly any significant amount of traffic that we actually carry. So the FCC is trying to get this started to be deployed in 2019, and the operators have really jumped up and have gone with this fairly quickly. But there's still a significant way to go before I think most people will see or perceive a significant change to the calls that you have coming in that are wrong. So there's other aspects that you can take, to mitigate some of the robocalling things, and those are still available. But Stir Shaken is starting to make it's a big dent into this. And I think as each month goes by, you're going to see more and more.
Yeah, I think by our estimates, we probably have just crossed in general industry about, just went into double digits in terms of the total amount of traffic being signed. That's a very high level estimate, but, and I don't quote me on it necessarily, but that's what we sort of think. it's one of those things where until these things are in the network, then the tools on top of them can start taking advantage of them. So nobody's blocking any calls because they're signed or not signed. Obviously, if you started blocking calls that aren't signed right now, you'd be blocking legitimate calls. Maybe at some point we can start doing that. But also, in terms of a lot of the analytics tools out there are actually negative indicator tools, so they can tell you whether it thinks it's spam. But a lot of them don't yet say hey, yeah, you should really pick up this call because you can trust that it's the person that is calling. So I think all those tools are going to evolve. The user experience hopefully will get better, as people learn how to adjust. And, quite frankly, people have just been trained not to pick up their phones anymore. So you just assume every call is a spam call now. So I think some of that psychology has to be changed as well. There's been some user studies that have tried to look at, what is the best way to display calls that are either validated or identified as spam. And the problem is that in these focus group, people just assume that everything's spam. So they don't even respond to those things. So I think it's just going to be a slow process. There's not going to be some magical day that everybody's happy with their calls. It's just tools will evolve, people's psychology will have to evolve, and hopefully we get to the point where people start trusting their phones again.
Yep. So attackers, always look for, whenever defense is put up, attackers look for new vectors to attack. And one of the things that was mentioned briefly in TAD Summit yesterday, there was a conversation a little bit about the fact that most of StirShaken at this point is a U.S. phenomenon. Of course, many of the attacks are U.S. based or directed anyway. But do you envision that some of the challenges with getting the rest of the globe to adopt StirShaken is going to present some challenges for its effectiveness here in the U.S., or can you comment on what you anticipate? Maybe it's an unfair question, although you're involved in standard bodies too, and obviously those are more international in nature. So can you comment on that at all?
I can start. I think it was the latest IETF. There was actually a summit of that Eric Berger had put together of all the. We invited international service provider representatives that to talk about where they are and what they're thinking about and things like that. And that definitely came up that to some of them, they didn't even think this was a problem they needed to even deal with. Just because, like you said, some countries, are just not as good economic targets as others. That said, there is also specs that have just been pushed through on a proposal for international border crossing in terms of telephone numbers. So obviously, Canada is a big part of the national North American numbering plan, and it's critical that we have some way of validating calls between Canada and the U.S. But there's two regulatory bodies. They have their own rules. They have their own policies, but we want to share at least the same tools in terms of PKI and identity headers and StirShaken and things like that. The UK has also been going down this road, although they've been looking. India as well has had some proposals out there too. Hopefully the world comes to some consensus. There may have to be some adaptation that happens. We'll just have to see how things play out.
Yeah, and just to add to that, primarily a lot of the global technology standards have been really focused in on all the 5G development that's been going on. That really took off several years ago and has been their top priority. Now that 5G is starting to be deployed, a lot of those standardization groups are starting to finally have a chance to look at features beyond what is just needed to provide basic service. But again, since this is kind of primarily a U.S.-centric problem, because when you do bring this up in international organizations, a lot of the other countries, they kind of like, yeah, it's not a big deal here. Either they're ignoring it or there's a cultural issue that it doesn't seem to bother them. Whatever that reason, trying to escalate to higher prioritization some of the standards effects that would happen in international standards bodies up higher is a fight, because you're going to fight against everybody else's features. So this tends to be a little bit lower. But thankfully, what we're doing here is we've been focusing in using U.S. standards bodies and then driving any additional requirements onto the network through local regulatory requirements to get things done. So I think keeping things kind of focused in the U.S. and North America is what's going to drive a lot of this work.
So I think we've got about 15 minutes left. Why don't we open this up for Q&A from the audience? Could you use the mic just because we're...
You mentioned before that about 4% of the traffic doesn't cross or experiences some kind of lack of verification. Any breakdown of what is the source of that?
Okay, so I just want to clarify, that is 4% of the traffic in the T-Mobile network on the 4th of October. So it's just one day. And it varies around 4% as we've looked at the week. That is traffic that has failed attestation under STIR/SHAKEN between T-Mobile's network, Comcast network, and AT&T's network. So it's a small subset of our total carrier. What we have seen a little bit is while that's riding right around 4%, we've seen an occasional drop-off. In fact, at the end of the week we just looked at, we saw another drop-off of that. Trying to understand what those stats are really telling us beyond 4% didn't have the attestation. It's a little early to really tell. We haven't been able to draw a conclusion what that means. Does it mean STIR/SHAKEN is working and the scammers are going elsewhere? Or does it just mean that the people who are placing calls that day have, were all attested? So we're not sure yet. So it's a little early in the time.
I look at this as a security problem, right? How much functionality and how much security and how much do you want to shut the door? So one question is, there's a lot of times, even in this conference, you meet people, you exchange phone numbers, but you're not in their call list or contact list, and you might not even be in America. You might be from another country. And you try to call them. How does STIR/SHAKEN work in that scenario? Because this external number, is it flagged as a robocall? And sometimes there's legitimate cold calling going on in several places. So if we are going to shut the door on all that, then in a way scammers are winning because we are giving up a certain amount of functionality that was useful. So any thoughts on that and how that could be incorporated into the system while still keeping the robocalls away?
Yeah, so I think that's sort of part of the thing I was mentioning, that these tools have to evolve. I think no matter what, we're sort of used to managing white lists of the folks that we talk with the most. I think, there's indicators. I think another feature Apple implemented that I saw was, you can turn on things where it'll only allow calls to people that you made outbound calls to. That might be one simple mechanism, but, I think in general, we're used to, when we meet and exchange telephone numbers, at least for me, I usually just make a call and, okay, here's my number. And you have that sort of initialization of putting somebody on a whitelist. So I think really the next evolution is going to be once we can trust these telephone numbers and let them in, we also want to manage, like, because they're still, even though telephone numbers are trusted, you're probably going to have people calling you for probably legitimate reasons, but, maybe you just want to filter them out or, have VIP lists or other things like that. There's also interesting thoughts about, having personal auto attendants that, maybe you have somebody press a code before, to start ringing your phone or, other mechanisms like that. And there's probably a lot more innovative ways of thinking about the problem on smartphones and other things that can allow these calls. So I think that's where, we're going to have lots of cool ways of managing your communications on public telephone networks.
I just want to add to that because I had alluded to this in my talk is that there's still a human factors aspect to this because as we start to deploy this, there's still going to be people outside of the stir-shaken community, which I think is what your question is. And as someone who spends about half of his life outside of the U.S., I often get phone calls that would be in my whitelist that do not appear as though they're a whitelisted phone number because when they come over, all of a sudden they'll append the country code to it or an extra routing code or something, and it looks like a very strange number. And I have to kind of look at that and then do a human interaction decode of, oh yes, that's my wife calling. I better answer that one. So there is still going to be some initial rough spots that have to be worked out. And eventually we have to come up with a real global solution that, uses some sort of certificate and trust that goes along with this. And there are additional things outside of just stir-shaken that have to be added to that to make sure that the network that it's originating from is trusted as well. And there is some work happening in that area. Does that help?
It does help. I just want to put this in context. One example is this is a university and students here. And it happened to me, actually, a couple things, both ways. One was I got a call from Google to interview, and then they sent an email to set up the interview, and that went to spam, right? And I never replied. And the guy called me while I was in a bar to interview me. I didn't get the job. But I wasn't going to. I had already gotten a job in Qualcomm. But another one was Vijay himself was in Canada once, and he was trying to do Google voice call with me when it was really new. And I think I got like 5 missed calls in 1 minute. And I was like, wow, what happened? Whose bill did I not pay now? So there is that, exactly that. And I spent half my time outside the United States. So that's exactly where I was coming from, is how is that going to work out? And eventually, as the system learns, I guess it'll probably have everybody in the system, so, it'll go down. That was the premise of it.
Yeah, I think there are still some warts that have to be addressed. This is looking primarily at North American type calls. When we look outside of North America, there are indeed other issues, and yeah, like the spam email is exactly the type of thing that we're coming from. Thankfully, tends to be the people who travel internationally become aware of these, and again, the human interaction adjusts to fit them. But I think eventually it'll get solved, and it'll happen through standardization, some security
So real quick though, I think maybe you're confusing this with a more sophisticated version of caller ID. So the fact that, for example, you got my business card, or I got your business card at this conference and we didn't know each other before, and maybe I tried to call you tomorrow and I'm not in your address book. So stir-shaken would not attempt to flag that call because it is a legitimate call. You don't know that it is. And so I think Chris kind of alluded to this in his presentation where he was talking about that it gives no it has no knowledge of intent. doesn't know what I'm intending to do or why so I guess I think you need to kind of differentiate between the fact that the person's not in your address book and it's a robocall or a spoofed call. So those are kind of two different things.
Well, and I think, part of the rich call data stuff that I mentioned is that we can also sign intents and other things that you can express and make that part of it. I think also, the social contract that we all have with each other and how we communicate with each other will evolve as well. And people will get used to techniques of and there's like multimodal communication. So is text messaging going to get involved? Is there, other things that may evolve as well? But having a telephone number that people can sort of anonymously call you is something that we need as a society, right? So we just need to figure out what those social norms, social contracts are and implement
We were
them.
talking about this topic a year or two ago at this conference, and Dean Bubley was mentioning that he wished there was an application where when he gets a call from somebody that he doesn't know, the application would say, "We'll connect your call. It's going to cost $3 a minute."
Yeah.
And then, after a minute or two, Dean could say, "Oh, this is a valuable call. I'm not going to charge you $3 a minute anymore." Or, "This is not a valuable call. Keep talking. I'll just keep billing you." So, Carol?
I just was going to do the same clarification. I mean, if I exchanged the information here, I would just perhaps see something that came in without validation, and then I could choose whether to answer or not, right? That's where we are right now. You're going to validate a certain minute portion of the calls right now, and I'm going to have to take my chances, right?
But I do think the adoption is going to ramp up very quickly over the next few months. So.
Yeah, and there's another part to this too, is that, if you start seeing in your network a significant amount of call originations coming from a single number going out to a lot of areas, you start to map that, and that helps you to be able to flag, that this might be a robocall originator, and if they don't already have a trust relationship with you, you might want to shut down that access to your network. So there's some other things that.
We have a messenger app which has several million users, and we assign a free phone number to every user. Means we have several million phone numbers from bandwidth. And I would like to get your suggestion. How do we support the store and the sharing protocol in our messenger app? It's a free number. We assign the user for free, and there are a lot of usages in our in the apps.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, those things are being debated right now, but, one of the techniques would hopefully be, at least what I'm advocating for is that the TN provider would be responsible for providing you the mechanism that allows you to have that telephone number validated. But you also have the responsibility that, you're doing good things with those numbers and not doing illegitimate things, otherwise bandwidth could shut you down for that. So, that's sort of the policy that's been talked about. The exact technical mechanisms are still being decided, and there might be multiple mechanisms available as well.
So you mean the current the technical specification has not been implemented yet?
Yeah, this indirect ownership thing, which is exactly what you're doing, is still being discussed.
Okay.
Yep. There's a lot of policy implications and other things, and we want to make sure it's done correctly and the trust chain is maintained.
So when this gets all rolled out and everybody's implemented it, which I realize will take some time, if I understand this correctly, you'll still get the call and the user has to decide based on the check mark whether to answer it or not, right? It's not going to automatically shut the call off because you don't have a check mark, correct?
Correct, yeah. So nobody, I believe, is blocking any calls yet. I think the FCC has given us permission to or recommended that we block calls. So that, yeah, so we actually do have active programs that if the telephone number being used is not an assigned or allocated number, we can block those calls, because obviously they're not destined to anything legitimate they're not coming from anything legitimate anyways. And that's like cut the number of calls by millions. I don't know the exact numbers, but it is in the millions per day.
So there isn't anything like, for example, no more robo cannot add any more value to what the standards you're proposing, right?
No, that's what I was going to say. Then you can have, like I mentioned before, you can have the tools on top. So you can have the call feature that says your preference for what calls you want to receive and which calls you want to block, or which calls you want to send a voicemail, or which calls you want to go through an IVR that validates that they're like a real human being instead of a robot or something like that. So those are the things that are going to come on top of this framework, so that you'll have the validation part and also like the personal preference on what calls you actually want to receive.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I promised Scott I wouldn't ask any questions, so I'm hereby breaking that promise. But maybe this is to something Warren was talking about. So we're, I think, in the 72nd year of the North American numbering plan right now. And so to what extent are the phone number as a methodology for certifying sustainable as we move from whatever we are today, 60, 70% IP-based communications in the U.S. to at some point it'll be 100, I assume. I hope that's a safe assumption. And is the industry thinking about other ways of using real-time communications outside of the traditional phone number ID, MISDN, in the mobile industry to identify and tag and certify calls?
So I think telephone numbers are going to be legitimate for a while. Like I said before, you need some way of calling somebody sort of anonymously. You want people to be able to contact you. Generally in the, like app world or WebRTC world or other things like that, you do use other identifiers, email addresses. FaceTime, you can collect either a bunch of telephones you're associated with. Well, they use the telephone number as an identifier that associates with you, but it's not routed over the telephone network. I think there's a place for both of those things. I think part of the reason there's sort of the regulated telephone world and things that are associated with that and all the things that come with it, 911 and all those great services. But then there's like your private communication networks. And to a great extent, like what we've done, and I think others have done, is merge those worlds. So you can have experiences that are in private real-time communications networks, as well as receiving calls from telephone networks, as well as, doing other things. So I think these ecosystems are going to be around for a while. I think telephone number as an identifier, it's just really convenient to have like a 10-digit number that's associated with you. That's a unique identifier. That's not your social security number. Obviously, you don't want to give that out. It's just something that, to be frank, I was sort of in your camp before that, like, why do we need these telephones? I can use my email address. Yeah. No, I was sort of in that camp.
It became a fashionable question probably 15 years ago when
but then
Skype started coming out. But so far it appears as though the death of the phone number has been greatly exaggerated.
Exactly. Yeah, go.
Just to add a little bit to that, because in the mobile world we're really using IMSI, as the identifier, and it's more of the routable type number, and the 10-digit North American numbering plan is just an add-on because it makes us feel warm and fuzzy because we're used to 10 digits. But in the international security world, as we're looking for trust, some of the things that we're trying to validate are based on devices. Is the device legitimate to originate the call? So there have even been discussions of, should we be looking at the equipment identifiers, or in places where there's not equipment identifiers, to add some sort of validated equipment identifiers. Yeah. So I mean, in the mobile world, we'd be talking about IMEI. With the discussions of dual SIMs and dual identities, do we need dual IMEI has been a question that has been asked even now. So there's been a lot of different areas coming to the task.
So on that note, we're 60 seconds over time, and we've got other sessions to go to. So I'm going to cut this off. But
Let me get my last question in here. And
no, I'm sorry. We're going to cut it off. We can talk to these guys afterwards because we got somebody else who's due up here. Sorry. So thanks very much to both Scott and Chris. And CAD Summit continues momentarily in this room. Thanks.